They thought it was going to be a routine day. Another courtroom. Another case. Another name on the schedule that no one would remember by the end of the week. The room was already filled when he walked in. Confident. Straight back. Uniform crisp and clean. A badge that caught the light every time he moved. To him, this place didn't feel intimidating. It felt familiar, almost boring. He had testified before. He had been thanked before. He had been trusted before. And today, he expected the same. What he didn't expect was the woman sitting silently at the front of the room. She didn't look angry. She didn't look nervous. She didn't even look curious. She looked calm. To calm. Most people in court try to look small. They avoid eye contact. They shift in their seats. They wait for permission to speak. She did none of that. Her posture was relaxed, but deliberate. Her hands rested neatly on the table. Her eyes were focused, not wandering. She wasn't watching him. She was watching everything. The officer noticed it for just a second, long enough to feel something unfamiliar. Discomfort. He shook it off immediately. People always looked at him differently when he entered a room like this, some with fear, some with respect, some with quiet resentment. He was used to it. What mattered was the authority, and he believed he had more of it than anyone else in that room. The case was called. He stepped forward with confidence, his boots echoing softly against the floor. Every movement practiced. Every gesture controlled. When he began speaking, his voice was firm, clear, unquestioning. He spoke as if the facts were already settled, as if the story had only one version. As if his word alone was enough. At first, no one interrupted him. The prosecutor nodded along. The spectators listened. Pens scratched against paper. Everything was going exactly as he expected, until it wasn't. From the bench, the judge leaned forward slightly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to change the air in the room. The officer paused. The judge asked a simple question. Not an accusation, not a challenge, just a question. The officer answered quickly, without hesitation. He had done nothing wrong. At least, that's what he believed. The judge listened, then asked another question. This time, the officer's tone shifted. Not much, just enough to be noticed. There was a hint of impatience, a hint of confidence turning into something sharper. He corrected the judge, not loudly. Not aggressively, but clearly. A few heads in the courtroom lifted. That wasn't common. The judge didn't react immediately. She simply nodded and asked him to repeat his statement. The officer sighed quietly. He repeated himself, more firmly this time. As if speaking slower would make the point land harder. He believed he was in control. What he didn't realize was that the room had begun to shift. The judge's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. They narrowed slightly, not in anger. In focus. She wasn't offended. She was measuring him. The prosecutor glanced down at the documents. The defense attorney stopped writing. Something was happening. The officer kept talking. He explained procedures. He explained protocol. He explained why his decision had been justified. Each sentence carried the same unspoken message. Trust me, I know better. The judge let him finish. Then she leaned back, and for the first time since the hearing began, she spoke with authority that couldn't be mistaken. She asked him where he had learned that procedure. The officer smiled slightly. He named his department. His training, his years of experience. There it was again, that confidence, that belief that his badge carried weight everywhere. The judge nodded once. Then she asked him to clarify something, a small detail, a technical point. The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. He answered anyway. And that was the moment everything changed. The judge reached for a file. She didn't rush. She didn't dramatize it. She opened it slowly and began to read. The room grew quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from boredom. The kind that comes when people realize they might be witnessing something important. She read aloud, policies, dates, training requirements. Then she stopped. She looked directly at the officer and asked him one final question. A question so simple that it left him with nowhere to hide. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The confidence was gone, replaced by something else. Uncertainty. The judge waited. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She gave him space. The officer tried to answer, but the words didn't land the way they had before. This time, his voice wavered barely, but enough the judge nodded again. And then she said something that made the entire courtroom freeze. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic but because it was precise. She explained who she was, not her title, her experience her background her authority and suddenly, the balance shifted. The officer's posture stiffened. He wasn't standing tall anymore. He was standing still, listening. For the first time since he had entered the room, he wasn't the one in control. The spectators exchanged glances. The prosecutor stopped nodding. The defense attorney leaned back, and the officer realized something far too late. This wasn't a routine day. This wasn't a room he controlled. And the woman he had dismissed with quiet confidence was not someone you challenge lightly. The judge closed the file and looked at him calm composed unmovable. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't embarrassed him. She had done something far worse. She had exposed him. And everyone in the room knew it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. And the officer knew whatever happened next would follow him far beyond this courtroom. The silence didn't end when the judge finished speaking. It stretched. Seconds passed. Then more. The officer stood there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed forward. Not defiant anymore. Not relaxed. Alert. The kind of alert that comes when someone realizes they might be standing on unstable ground. The judge didn't rush him. She never did. She adjusted the papers in front of her, as if this were just another ordinary moment. But everyone in the room felt it. This was no longer about testimony. This was about credibility. The judge asked him to step back through his timeline once more. Slowly. Carefully. This time, she didn't ask questions one after another. She waited between them, long enough for discomfort to settle in. The officer cleared his throat before answering. His voice was still firm, but the confidence had thinned. He described the stop again, the reason, the sequence of events. But now, every word felt heavier, because now, he knew he was being listened to differently. The judge stopped him halfway through. She asked why his report omitted a specific detail, not an accusation, just a question. The officer frowned slightly. He said it was irrelevant. The judge tilted her head just enough to signal interest. She asked him, who decides relevance in a court of law? The officer didn't answer right away. Someone in the gallery shifted in their seat. The prosecutor glanced up, then back down. The judge waited. When the officer finally responded, his voice was lower. He said the court decides. The judge nodded. And then she asked why the court hadn't been given all the information. That's when his breathing changed. It wasn't obvious. Most people wouldn't notice it. But anyone who had ever been under pressure recognized it immediately. Shorter breaths, slower words. The officer tried to explain. He said the situation was dynamic, that decisions had to be made quickly, that not everything could be documented perfectly. The judge listened, and then she asked him if speed justified omission. The officer shook his head slightly. No. She asked if procedure allowed discretion. Yes. She asked where discretion ended. The officer hesitated, and that hesitation landed louder than any answer. The judge leaned forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to bring the room closer. She explained something calmly. Something simple. That authority does not come from a uniform. It comes from accountability. The officer's jaw tightened. She continued. She explained that the courtroom is not a place where assumptions are rewarded. It's a place where details matter. Every word she spoke felt measured. Intentional. Not to humiliate him, but to strip away the shield he believed he was wearing. The officer attempted to regain footing. He referenced department policy again. Training manuals. Standard operating procedures. But now, every reference sounded defensive. The judge asked for the policy documentation. The officer said it wasn't immediately available. The judge nodded. And then she asked if he expected the court to rely on memory rather than evidence. The room grew even quieter. The officer shifted his weight. For the first time, he looked unsure where to stand. The judge turned her attention to the attorneys. She asked if either side had additional materials. The defense attorney raised a hand, slowly, almost cautiously, and then placed a document on the table. The judge reviewed it. Her expression didn't change, but the officer noticed. He recognized the document before she said a word. It was his report with annotations, highlighted sections, timestamps. The judge read aloud a passage, then another, then paused. She asked the officer to explain the discrepancy between his spoken testimony and his written statement. The officer swallowed. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. The judge asked where. The officer said possibly in phrasing. The judge asked which phrase. The officer didn't answer immediately because now the gap was visible, not just to him, to everyone. The judge closed the document. She didn't slam it. She didn't emphasize it. She simply closed it. And then she spoke in a tone that changed the direction of the entire hearing. She explained that when an officer testifies, the court assumes good faith, but that assumption is conditional. It relies on consistency, accuracy, transparency. She explained that credibility, once questioned, is difficult to restore. The officer stared straight ahead. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was listening. She asked him one last time if there was anything he wanted to clarify. Anything at all. The officer opened his mouth, then paused, then closed it. He said no. The judge nodded. She thanked him for his testimony. Just like that. No lecture. No anger. But everyone understood what had just happened. The judge turned to the attorneys and began discussing next steps. But the officer barely heard her because something had shifted inside him. The confidence he walked in with was gone, replaced by the realization that authority without awareness is fragile. The gallery buzzed quietly as people processed what they had witnessed. Not a shouting match, not a dramatic outburst. Something far more unsettling, a calm dismantling. The officer stepped back, his movements slower now, measured. As if he were recalibrating how much space he was allowed to take, he returned to his seat, and for the first time, he avoided eye contact. The judge continued the hearing, but the tone was different now. Sharper, more deliberate. Every question that followed carried weight, and the officer knew his role in this case was no longer secure. He wasn't the authority in the room. He was a subject of scrutiny, and that reality followed him as the session adjourned. As people stood and began to exit, conversations sparked quietly, whispers, glances. The officer remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the table, replaying the moment when control slipped away, not because someone took it from him, but because he assumed it was his to begin with. And somewhere between the badge and the bench, he learned the difference. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than before. Not physically, emotionally. People moved past him without looking, not out of fear, not out of respect, out of awareness. The officer stood near the wall for a moment, his back straight, his hands folded loosely in front of him, as if still on duty. But something had shifted in the way he held himself. Inside the courtroom, he had felt exposed. Out here, he felt visible. To visible. He could hear fragments of conversation as people passed. Not insults, not praise. Observations. Quiet ones, the kind that linger. He told himself it didn't matter, that hearings continued all the time. That scrutiny was part of the job, but this felt different. This wasn't criticism from a superior officer. This wasn't a complaint from a civilian. This was a public unraveling. And it didn't end when the doors closed. Later that day, the call came, not from his supervisor, not from internal affairs, from someone higher. The tone was neutral, professional, but the message was clear. They wanted to review the footage, all of it. The officer said there was nothing to hide. He believed that. At least, he wanted to. The review began quietly. No announcements. No accusations. Just questions, requests for documentation, clarification on procedure. At first, it felt manageable, routine, but then came the pauses, the long ones, the ones where people stopped taking notes and simply watched, moments replayed frame by frame, words compared against timestamps, actions slowed down until intention became impossible to ignore. The officer felt the same sensation he had felt in the courtroom, that tightening in the chest, that awareness that explanation was no longer enough. Meanwhile, outside that room, the story was moving, slowly. Carefully. But it was moving. People who had been present in court talked, not loudly. Just honestly. About what they saw, about how it felt, about how calm the judge was, about how unprepared the officer seemed. The contrast stuck with them, not anger versus authority, composure versus assumption. The judge returned to her work as she always did. No statements. No interviews. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions had already spoken. Those who knew her weren't surprised. She had spent years building her reputation not on intimidation, but precision. She didn't overpower people. She outlasted them. Back at the department, the officer was placed on administrative leave. Standard procedure. Temporary. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when questions went unanswered. He told himself it would pass, that clarity would come, that context would matter. But as days turned into weeks, clarity brought something else. Distance. Colleagues who once joked freely now chose their words carefully. Conversation shortened. Eye contact lingered less. No one accused him outright. No one needed to. The silence did enough. He replayed the courtroom moment again and again. The question he couldn't answer, the document he hadn't expected, the calm voice that never rose. He realized something uncomfortable. The judge hadn't trapped him. He had walked into it himself, assuming familiarity where caution was required, assuming respect where accountability was demanded. The badge had always worked before, until it didn't. When the review concluded, the findings were precise. No dramatic language, no condemnation, just facts, inconsistencies, procedural lapses, judgment errors, enough to warrant consequences. The officer was reassigned, not as punishment, they said, as evaluation, but everyone knew what it meant. Trust had been disrupted, and trust, once shaken, is slow to return. The case itself moved forward, without his testimony carrying the weight it once would have. The outcome shifted, not because of bias, because of credibility, and that distinction mattered more than he had ever realized. Months later, the courtroom was full again. Another case. Another day. The judge took her seat, calm as ever. Prepared. The room settled instantly, not because she demanded it, because she had earned it. Some of the faces were new, some were familiar, but one was missing, and people noticed. Not because he was important, but because absence can speak as loudly as presence. The story followed him quietly, not in headlines, in memory. In training sessions. In whispered advice to new officers. In reminders about preparation, about humility. About knowing where authority begins and where it ends. For the officer, life moved on. Slower. More cautiously. He listened more than he spoke, questioned more than he assumed. The confidence never fully returned, but something else did. Awareness. And that awareness stayed with him every time he entered a room where power was not guaranteed, where respect had to be earned. Where silence could be louder than a command. The courtroom had taught him something no manual ever had. That authority isn't something you carry in. It's something the room allows you to keep, and once it's gone, you don't get it back the same way. Time has a way of smoothing sharp moments, but it doesn't erase them. Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the case files were archived, the memory of that day remained, not as a dramatic headline, not as a viral clip. As a lesson for those who were there. It became a reference point, a moment they returned to when something felt off, when confidence felt misplaced, when authority felt assumed rather than earned. The judge never spoke about it publicly. She never needed to. Her work continued the same way it always had, measured, focused. Exact. People who appeared before her noticed something immediately. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She didn't dominate the room. She let the room reveal itself. And in that space, people often revealed themselves to. New officers came and went, some confident, some cautious, but the ones who stayed learned quickly. This courtroom wasn't a place for shortcuts. It wasn't impressed by titles. It wasn't swayed by uniforms. It listened carefully. The officer, now removed from the center of attention, learned to live with the echo of that silence. The moment when he realized he was no longer guiding the narrative, he remembered how fast confidence can turn into exposure. How quickly control can slip when it's built on assumption. At first, the memory felt like punishment. Later, it felt like instruction. He began preparing differently, speaking less, listening more. He learned to anticipate questions instead of dismissing them, to respect the room before entering it. Some nights, he replayed the judge's voice in his head, not the words, the tone. Calm. Unmoved. Certain. It reminded him that real authority doesn't announce itself. It waits. For the people who watched that day, the impact was quieter, but lasting. They talked about how nothing explosive happened. No shouting. No humiliation. And yet, no one forgot it, because they had seen something rare. Power meeting restraint, confidence meeting precision, assumption meeting accountability. They realized how easily moments like that could be missed. How often they were missed. And how important it was when they weren't. The courtroom moved on. It always does. But something subtle changed. People came in a little more prepared, a little more careful with their words, a little more aware of the weight of truth, because they had seen what happens when someone mistakes presence for authority, when they assume the room belongs to them and the room quietly disagrees. Years later, if you asked those who were there what they remembered most, they wouldn't talk about the case itself. They wouldn't mention the charges or the verdict or the paperwork. They would talk about the pause, that moment when the judge stopped speaking, when the officer realized he had nothing left to add, when the room understood that something had shifted. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently, and that's how these moments endure. Not as stories of humiliation, but as reminders that power without humility is fragile, that confidence without preparation is dangerous, that authority, when real, never needs to be proven. It simply holds and waits for the truth to catch up, even after the case faded. From public discussion, the moment stayed alive in smaller ways. Law students studied the transcript, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Professors paused the video during lectures, pointing out the moment where everything changed without a single raised voice. They asked students to identify when control shifted. Most guessed wrong. They pointed to the question, or the answer, or the pause. But the real shift happened earlier. It happened the moment the judge chose not to interrupt. That choice became a lesson. Silence, when used intentionally, and be more powerful than command. In legal circles, the judge's name became associated with a certain kind of courtroom discipline, not harsh, not lenient. Exact. Attorneys who appeared before her adjusted their style. They avoided exaggeration. They avoided theatrics. They knew the room didn't reward noise. It rewarded clarity. The officer, years later, would admit to a colleague that the experience changed how he viewed authority entirely. He said it taught him that respect isn't enforced by posture or volume. It's earned through preparation. He stopped relying on confidence as armor. He began treating it as a byproduct, something that appears naturally when the facts are solid. He trained younger officers differently. He warned them not about judges, but about assumptions. He told them the courtroom isn't a place to perform. It's a place to survive truth, and truth doesn't care how sure you sound. The public, meanwhile, remembered the moment differently. For them, it wasn't a legal lesson. It was human. They saw someone who expected dominance and counter restraint, someone who expected momentum and counter patience. They saw how quickly power can feel small when it meets calm. People replayed the clip not because it was explosive, but because it felt unsettling. There was no villain speech. No hero monologue, just a quiet unraveling, and that made it real. Some viewers said the moment reminded them of times they themselves had spoken too quickly, times they assumed understanding instead of confirming it, times they mistook confidence for correctness. It stayed with them because it wasn't about law. It was about accountability. The courtroom itself, unchanged in appearance, seemed different afterward. The benches were the same, the seal was the same, but the atmosphere felt heavier. As if the room remembered, as if it carried the echo of that pause and waited for the next person to test it. And many did. Some entered confidently, some cautiously, but all left understanding something important, that this was a place where stories are tested, not accepted. Where authority is questioned, not assumed, where silence can be louder than speech. The judge once said, quietly, to a clerk, that the hardest part of her job wasn't making decisions. It was knowing when not to speak. She understood that restraint creates space. And in that space, people reveal more than they intend. That philosophy defined her career, not because it was dramatic, but because it worked. Years from now, long after the judge retires, the clip will still circulate, passed from screen to screen, shared without context. And still, people will feel it. They'll sense the shift, the imbalance, the moment where expectation collapses under precision. They may not understand the legal nuance. They may not remember the case, but they'll recognize the feeling, that moment when certainty falters, when authority pauses, when the room decides who truly holds control. And that's why this moment matters. Not because someone was embarrassed, not because someone was corrected, but because it showed how power actually works. Quietly, deliberately, without warning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.